But first, if Hamas released the hostages and if Hezbollah stopped firing rockets, well, we'd have peace in the Middle East. But as it turns out, terrorists aren't so crazy about peace. Terrorists love taking hostages. Terrorists also love firing rockets. And in a twist of fate no one saw coming, terrorists also have quite a bit of support in marginal Labor Sydney seats. That's not conjecture. Hundreds of people marched through Sydney this week chanting support for Hezbollah, a registered terrorist organisation. Our government is so concerned about displays like that, they've issued visas to almost 3,000 Palestinians. But don't worry, they've all been security checked. In fact, some of them were even security checked before they got here. Poor fellow, my country. So what is the federal Labor government to do when terrorists won't play nice and when people supporting terrorist organisations are weighing up how to vote in next year's federal election? Well, Foreign Minister Penny Wong went to the United Nations overnight and berated the Middle East's only liberal democracy for not playing fair.
War has rules, even when confronting terrorists, even when defending borders, civilians need to be protected.
If you really must confront terrorists and if you really must defend your borders, well, there are rules. Are you kidding me? Fair-minded people around the world are aware just how far Israel has gone in order to protect civilians. What other army warns civilians in advance of an attack? Anyway, she continued.
Nearly a year ago, Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis, the worst loss of Jewish life in a single day since the Holocaust, and Hamas terrorists continue to hold hostages.
Was it Joseph Stalin who quipped, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic"? How quickly our foreign minister breezily mentions 1,200 dead Jews, neglecting to mention how many of them were first beaten, raped, burned and beheaded. Oh, and incidentally, Hamas terrorists continue to hold hostages. We might pause for a moment and think about that. Hostages, Israeli civilians snatched from their families and held underground for the past 11 months. One of those hostages still being held by terrorists is a 1-year-old baby. I said we might pause to think about that, but Australia's Foreign Minister was rushing to get to her preferred talking point, Israel's response.
In Israel's response, over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, more than 11,000 children, and more than 300 aid workers since this war began. Gaza is the deadliest place on earth to be an aid worker.
Since this war began, it's such a banal, lazy turn of phrase. Since Hamas, the governing body of Gaza, invaded a liberal democratic state and started slaughtering people before returning home to celebrate is, I think, what Penny Wong meant to say. As for the assertion that Gaza is one of the deadliest places to be an aid worker, well, indeed it is. But you know, even before October 7, Gaza was one of the deadliest places in the world to be a homosexual or transgender or a Jew or a Christian. And before Gaza was one of the deadliest places in the world to be an aid worker, just across the border from Gaza was one of the deadliest places in the world to be a Jew enjoying a music festival, as almost 400 dead young people would attest, if they could.
President, the world demands a ceasefire in Gaza. Hostages must be released. Aid must flow. This humanitarian catastrophe must end.
Yeah, if the world demanded the release of the hostages rather than as including them as steak knives that incidentally should probably come with a ceasefire, then the world, whom Penny Wong purports to speak for, might see some progress. But the Australian Labor government doesn't have time for such trivialities as moral clarity.
We cannot wait for the parties to do this themselves, and we cannot allow any party to obstruct the prospect of peace.
By the parties and any party, Australia's Foreign Minister is putting the democratic state of Israel on parity with a violent Islamist terrorist organisation. And she wonders why Israel is disinclined to listen to her or the international community she claims to represent. Anyway, having solved the Gaza situation by effectively saying Israel should just stop it, Penny Wong then moved her attention to Hezbollah.
Hezbollah are terrorists that have not complied with the Security Council Resolution 1701, but Lebanese civilians should not pay the price. De-escalation is urgent, dialogue is needed, and parties must implement this resolution in full.
Any sentence that effectively begins, "I agree these guys are murderous terrorists, however," is never going to end well for freedom-loving people. Penny Wong is right that Hezbollah has not complied with Security Council Resolution 1701. I might add, that resolution was put in place 18 years ago. How can Penny Wong say Hezbollah is a terrorist organisation that has for the past 18 years refused to comply with Security Council resolutions and conclude dialogue is needed? Does she even listen to herself? And isn't it amazing how Penny Wong wasn't advocating for dialogue while Hezbollah were firing thousands of rockets at Israeli civilians over the past 12 months? But she's all about everyone sitting down for a chat now that Israel has decided to defend itself.
Australia believes Lebanon cannot become the next Gaza. Just as in Gaza, we call for an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon.
Penny Wong doesn't want Gaza to become the next Lebanon, or rather Lebanon to become the next Gaza. Well, you know, Israel doesn't want northern Israel to become the next southern Israel, or tomorrow to become the next October 7. So while everyone wants peace, the Israelis might be well advised to ignore everything our government says. And Australians might be well advised to bear in mind how weak-kneed our government is in the face of terrorists. God help us if we were ever in Israel's position, because the United Nations and Penny Wong sure wouldn't be much assistance.